And we're away. Well, hello and welcome to 30 Plus and Fabulous. This is a women's community, mostly New Zealand-based women, and we're in the middle of a bit of a political series at the moment, and we're just talking about things that are really, hot topics of discussion at the moment, and just inviting a few people along to have their 2 cents about different things. So welcome, Richard McLeod, lawyer.
Thank you.
I'd love you just to introduce yourself to the ladies and tell them a little bit about yourself. That'd be awesome.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and hello everybody. My name's Richard McLeod. I'm the proud husband of Rebecca and the proud father of 3 beautiful girls, aged 4 and under. And I'm an immigration, refugee and human rights lawyer based in Auckland.
Awesome. And so, Richard, tell us a little bit about what you do and how you stumbled upon the euthanasia debate, I guess we're calling it at the moment, because it's a pretty serious bill that's looking like it is about to go to vote. And
Yes.
as I understand it, I'm unpacking a little bit more, it's not quite as it seems. So you've done thorough investigations into this yourself. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that's right. Everything is definitely not quite what it seems. And I think the interesting thing is that the polls are starting to really shift on this debate. They used to be about 75% of New Zealanders were in favour. They've now slid down to about 63%. Of course, the Act will only pass into law if it is voted at 51%. But I think there is a reason why the polls are starting to shift, and that is because more and more New Zealanders are starting to wake up to the realization of what this proposed law actually means, and are starting to really develop concerns about whether or not it is safe. Now, I'm here in my capacity, certainly as a lawyer, but also as the spokesperson for a group of 200 lawyers, many of them QCs, and about 12 legal academics. So some of those people are Queen's Counsel. So they are, I suppose, lawyers who have achieved a great deal of distinction in their careers, very senior practitioners.
Yeah.
And we all have very, very differing ideological views about the rights and wrongs of euthanasia. That's not what we are concerned about. What we are concerned about is this law and whether it is safe. And we are unanimously of the view that this is an extremely dangerous law. It hasn't been well drafted, and it's going to put at risk the lives of countless vulnerable New Zealanders.
Okay, so can I just tell you briefly what I've seen in the group from the women in the group when we've discussed this law, and most of the women in there are pro-choice. They're like, let them make the decision, let them choose. Some of them have even said, I heard my grandmother crying, screaming through the night for a week before she died. She shouldn't have had to do that. Just explain to us how you could oppose this particular law.
So no problem. I certainly have no problem with people having differing views on the rights and wrongs of euthanasia. Everyone's got their own personal experience, and I think all of us bring our own personal experiences to this debate. And even if we agree that euthanasia is necessary in some situations, that's fine. The question is, the biggest question for New Zealanders is, how do you wrap a law around that? And is the law that we have been given by Parliament genuinely safe? And because it has to be safe, because we are really talking here about the most serious things that we could ever do as a nation to end the life of another person if they request it. 30, 40 years ago, our country abolished capital punishment, execution, because we could not stand the notion that one innocent person might wrongfully be executed. Now we are considering a law which is going to allow doctors, supported by our government, to begin ending the lives of certain numbers of people who are eligible and who request it. And that kind of law is something that we have to look at very, very carefully and truly ask ourselves if it's safe. Because if it's not, if there are going to be wrongful deaths and people are going to be pressured or manipulated into this process, then we can't, in good conscience, I think, as New Zealanders, vote for that law. Now, as I said, this is not a referendum on the rights or wrongs of euthanasia. I think a lot of people think it is. It's not.
Okay.
It's a referendum on whether this particular law should be passed, should be put into force or not.
Right now.
Yeah, and so it's yes or no.
Yeah.
And we have been given a law which, in our view as lawyers, is hopelessly flawed and is in fact very dangerous. And we're not being asked the third question, which is, you know, if we can fix it, would you vote for it? There's no such question. It's yes or no. Now, that is the question that your viewers and that New Zealanders are going to have to decide on or before election day. But the law is dangerous. It is far too risky, and it is flawed in our view in multiple respects.
Okay, so
I mean, this, yeah, and I can just explain that there are a lot of different organisations and individuals who have come out opposed to this law. I mean, that includes the New Zealand Disability Rights Commissioner, Paula Tesoriero, the New Zealand Medical Association, the Australian and New Zealand Society of General Palliative Medicine, the Australian New Zealand Society for Geriatric Medicine, Palliative Care Nurses New Zealand, Hospice New Zealand, 1,750 doctors,
wow.
200 lawyers. And just today, I see that there are 30 leading psychologists, some of our country's best psychologists, who have just signed an open letter basically saying that this is very dangerous. Because
so
this
Richard,
is actually,
how can this many qualified and, you know, fairly amazing professionals, how can this many people who oppose this law be completely disregarded, and this law can actually be a yes or no vote right now?
well, people have been speaking their concerns about this law for many years because it's gone through a parliamentary process, a select committee process. The select committee, 90% of the submissions to the select committee were opposed. Many organisations wrote their opposition. The select committee said, we don't know what to do with this. They handed it over to Parliament, and then the original draft act was changed, and it was restricted only to terminal illness. But it doesn't remove the very serious concerns that so many professionals and organisations and individuals have about this law. And really the key question again is this: is it safe? Now, I know that people want choice, and so they should have it. People in New Zealand, we want more and more choice in a lot of different areas of our lives. But are we asking for choice in this particular topic? Are we asking for choice at the expense of harming or killing the weakest and most vulnerable members of our country? Because, and the question we have to ask ourselves is, will there genuinely be choice? Will everybody who avails themselves of euthanasia or assisted suicide under this law really be exercising a true choice? Or will they, for example, have no other choice? And we can look at that. And will they really be truly giving their consent, or have they been manipulated or pressured into the process?
So you're talking about the legal part of this bill now, whether they're going to actually be protected from
That's right.
being coerced and all that sort of thing.
That's right. I think there is a PowerPoint presentation there. You're welcome to open it if you like.
Yep,
if you can.
Yeah.
And I can walk your viewers through it.
I'll just share that screen. Won't be a second. Make that nice and big.
If you go down to the second or third page, perhaps.
Oops, where are we?
Just go up one page, thank you.
Oop, going a bit.
Yep. So, as lawyers, our biggest concern is whether this is safe, and we just think that this act is too dangerous. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to give you 3 key reasons why we have real concerns with this particular law. But I want to just take your readers, your viewers through the eligibility criteria of this particular law, okay? Because they need to be fleshed out, because even just the eligibility criteria are very vague and open to, very ambiguous. And I think there are real dangers even in those criteria. To access assisted dying, they call it. Now, assisted dying is euthanasia or assisted suicide. That means either that a doctor will give you a lethal injection, if you're eligible, to end your life, or enable you to administer the lethal dose yourself through intravenous or some other means.
Yeah.
So that's what assisted dying is. And to access this, as you can see from the eligibility criteria, you have to be aged 18 years or over.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's just stop right there. 18 years of age or over. So an 18-year-old could access euthanasia or assisted suicide under this law. And by the way, they could do that without their family or friends even knowing. That is entirely possible because other aspects of this law.
Do they have to be terminally ill at the age of 18 to access this assisted
That's
dying?
exactly right. I'm sorry if I didn't point that out. You would have to be an 18-year-old who was eligible, who met the criteria and then went through this particular process. But the point I'm making is that you could actually be 18 with a terminal illness and get euthanasia without your family or friends knowing about it.
Wow.
But the other problem with this is that the age limit is actually discriminatory. The former Attorney General, Chris Finlayson, told Parliament that this discriminates against 16 and 17-year-olds who should also be entitled to access euthanasia, and that is a breach of our Bill of Rights Act. So I suspect that if this law does pass, we will probably see challenges in the future by people who are even younger than 18 saying, well, why should some terminally ill people have this right over the age of 18 and not people like us? Why should you discriminate against us? So that's the first point. The second criterion is that they have to be a New Zealand citizen or resident. Okay. The third one, suffers from a terminal illness. Well, medicine doesn't even use the word terminal anymore, so that's the first problem. The second problem is that medical diagnosis is often or can be fraught with error. People get this wrong. Doctors misdiagnose people in New Zealand every year. There are at least 20 to 30 cases of misdiagnosis. Just 2 years ago in Dunedin, a woman was diagnosed with lung cancer, and she started to say her goodbyes and moved herself into hospice care, only to discover that another scan revealed that she had no cancer whatsoever. Wow. So that's diagnosis. There's problems with misdiagnosis. And then the rest of that line says that the terminal illness must be likely to end the person's life within 6 months. Well, medical doctors can't accurately estimate that in all cases. In fact, it's a very, very difficult thing to prognose how long someone has got to live. And we know that from the case of Lucretia Seales herself. Lucretia Seales, as your viewers may know, was the Wellington lawyer who brought a case in the High Court some years ago and actually started this whole process. She was diagnosed with a terminal brain tumor or cancer, and she was given weeks to live, and she ended up living for over 4 years.
Yeah.
Now, there's another woman now, Vicky Walsh, who has done a lot of media on this very issue opposed to the Act. She's got the same condition that Lucretia Seales had. She's been alive now for 9 years.
Wow.
And initially being given only a short time to live.
Yeah.
And so you really have to start asking, well, how can you even say whether any terminal illness is likely to end someone's life within 6 months?
So diagnosis is one thing and prognosis is a completely different story. You just can't. It's how long is a piece of string.
That's right. If you look at the next criterion, an advanced state of irreversible decline in physical capability. I mean, that's just open to debate. What is advanced? What does irreversible really mean? What about the next criterion? So the person has to experience unbearable suffering. Now, I think a lot of New Zealanders believe this is all about alleviating pain at the end of life. But in fact, if you look at every other euthanasia law around the world, physical pain is not the reason that people are choosing this. In fact, the overwhelming number of cases, at least 75% of people who are being helped to die or sorry, euthanized or given assisted suicide, are in fact doing it because of psychological reasons, not physical pain. And so unbearable suffering doesn't just mean physical pain. What we will see, in fact, as we've seen elsewhere in the world, are that people are going to be choosing to end their lives because, for example, they're lonely. 13.7% of Canadians last year who were euthanized said that one of their main reasons was because they were lonely and isolated.
Wow.
34% of Canadians who ended their lives last year under their euthanasia law, and 59% of people in Oregon under their assisted suicide law said it was because they were a burden on their friends, family, or caregivers.
Unbelievable. So it's a lack of hope rather than, a lack of action.
So, well, that's right. I mean, if these are the kinds of psychological sufferings that New Zealanders in the future who are terminally ill are going to be choosing as for reasons why they would want to have euthanasia, then really we are creating a system where we're saying to these people, we can't care for you, or we won't care for you, but we can help you to end your life. And you have to really start asking, is there really choice and compassion in helping a person end their lives just because they don't want to be a bother, or because they feel lonely and isolated? In New Zealand, 1 in 5 elderly New Zealanders, according to a recent report from Otago University, suffer from extreme loneliness. Most of them over the age of 75. So that's psychological suffering, and that comes back to this whole definition of unbearable suffering. And then the final criterion is competency. The person has to be competent to be able to make an informed decision about assisted dying. And that brings me back to the psychologists, the 30 psychologists who are coming out publicly today against this act. They are saying that our medical doctors are not sufficiently trained in their level of skill and training to actually assess mental competency. And it's going to be doctors who are going to be on the front line of this process. Now, psychologists are now coming out saying, well, doctors are actually going to be working outside of their scope of training if they start undertaking competency tests for people who request to die under this law. So that's just the eligibility criteria that are problematic. But there's a lot more than that. In fact, that's not even the main reason why we are really concerned about this law. But let's maybe move to the next slide, and I can take you through, I suppose, our perhaps 3 of our biggest reasons why we are really concerned about this. And the first one drives at the whole notion of choice. You see, the ex-supporters talk about giving choice, and that's fine. We want choice. People want to have choice in their dying. But the problem is this, that there are a lot of New Zealanders who don't have any choice when it comes to their healthcare, when it comes to their families, their lives, their financial affairs, or whatever. Because choice is not something that our health system can deliver equitably to everybody.
Yeah.
You see, if you're wealthy and privileged and you have access to medical insurance and you can get funding of medication for your terminal illness, if you can access good palliative care, great. Yeah, you've got choices. But if you live in Upper Northland and you can't get access to good palliative care there because of a shortage of it, or if you have just been denied funding for the cancer drug Keytruda, this is the cancer drug which 1,800 lung cancer patients in New Zealand have just been denied.
Wow.
And, Pharmac is saying, sorry, we're not going to fund medication that will keep you alive for years. If you're one of those people, what choice do you have?
Yeah.
And I think I really urge your viewers to start thinking along those lines. Really, what are we actually delivering here, and who are we delivering it to? Because this act is, I think, supposed to be for people who are not vulnerable, who have lots of choices, and then make an informed decision. But in reality, it's going to apply to everybody who's terminally ill and meets the criteria, and that includes people in really vulnerable situations, people who actually don't have any other choice. And that is, I think, a real concern to us. let's just quickly look at the state of our society and our healthcare system. We have inequitable palliative care across the country. We have a Maori claim before the Waitangi Tribunal that our healthcare system is sick and racist and is failing Māori.
Yeah.
We have terminally ill Kiwis being denied whāmek.
Yeah.
We have widespread loneliness and isolation amongst our elderly.
Yeah.
We've got rampant elder abuse. 90,000 elderly people are victims of elder abuse.
That's just
now,
insane.
And into this mix, we are now seriously considering whether to throw this end-of-life choice bomb. And it's going to apply to everybody who's terminally ill who meets the criteria. Now that includes wealthy and privileged Kiwis who get lots of choices, who live in the right postcode, who can probably get through their medical insurance, get good medication to keep them alive for years. But it's also going to apply to the poor, the weak, the neglected, and the defenceless. Now, there are hundreds, as I said before, of terminally ill Kiwis across this country who can't get proper palliative care. And there are thousands of Kiwis who have been denied whāmek medication that could keep them alive for years. And you have to ask, well, what choice are those people really going to have?
Yeah, that's right.
So what New Zealanders, I think, have been asked to vote through here is that we're really going to be telling these people who are already being failed by our health system, we can't care for you, but we can help you to end your lives.
And do you think that that is going to be a possibility of happening? I mean, do you think that doctors are going to end up being ones who suggest it because they can't offer them any other resources?
Well, we have a situation here where our healthcare system is already failing people. You know, we know from statistics that 42% of our healthcare budget at the moment is occupied by people over the age of 65.
Yeah.
Okay, every DHB in our country is in the red.
Yeah.
We have a growing aging population. We're going to have double the number of elderly people in the next 30 years in this country. We're about to enter probably one of the biggest economic crises that we've ever faced as a nation. People are living longer and they are also living sicker. And into this particular problem, we're going to suddenly find terminally ill people who find themselves eligible for euthanasia with a healthcare system that is failing them. And you really, again, it comes back to this question of choice. Do these people really have choice or not? Because I would say there isn't really choice or compassion in ending the lives of people that we can't care for or that we won't care for.
So, I mean, without getting, conspiratorial on you, do you feel like this could potentially be a financial thing? They're pushing this bill through because it's going to take the weight off the DHB.
There is a very real possibility that that could happen. 2 years ago in Canada, they commissioned a report, the government commissioned a report into what their savings could be through their euthanasia program. And they found that they could save up to $130 million a year through delivering euthanasia. Now, right there, you've got 130 million reasons why whāmek is going to love this particular law. And you have to ask yourself, is it only going to be really a matter of time before some government in the future, or maybe even this government, is going to wake up and realize that it can save a vast amount of money, taxpayers' dollars, on encouraging and promoting euthanasia and helping mostly elderly people end their lives, because these laws are mostly for the elderly. 80% of assisted dying laws around the world are accessed by elderly people.
So,
and sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, can we rewind a little bit and can I ask you then why, for what reason are they pushing it through now if they haven't already discovered that it's going to save them a great deal of money? What's the reason for them to push it through this quickly without enough people knowing what this bill really, really means? I don't know what it really, really means. And, you're explaining it to me right now.
No, I don't. I'm not for a moment suggesting that there is currently some kind of governmental conspiracy behind this. Not at all. What I'm saying is that there is a very real risk that could become government policy in the future.
Yeah,
absolutely. Because what this is going to create is a very significant financial disincentive for a future government to really put the funding into our healthcare system that it needs to keep everybody alive and to care for people, especially when we've got more and more elderly people. Now, please don't for a moment think that this couldn't happen in New Zealand. This nearly happened 25 years ago. In the mid-90s, when Selwyn Manning, an investigative journalist, uncovered a secret conspiracy within the Ministry of Health to deny end-stage care and medication to people with end-stage renal failure. And they did that using very eugenically driven factors, such as if the person is blind, if they have an intellectual disability, if they have served a time in prison. In other words, they said that those people can be denied that treatment. Now, fortunately, that was uncovered, but it has nearly happened in New Zealand before. And the problem is, I think that this particular law could very well expose vulnerable New Zealanders, mostly elderly, to that very real risk in future, particularly at the moment when we have a health system that is under huge pressure and is already failing so many people in New Zealand. I mean, look at the situation for New Zealand Māori at the moment. They are overrepresented in just about every concerning aspect of healthcare that we have. They're overrepresented in our suicide rates, in our terminal illness rates, in our chronic illness rates, in our disability rates, and in our mental illness rates.
So sad.
And I do really feel genuinely concerned that that although the drafters of this law have acted with the best of intentions, they are unwittingly going to foist this law onto people who are in very weak and vulnerable situations.
So why are these drafters not taking heed to the advice or the outcries of all of these lawyers, all of these specialists, all of these psychologists? Why are they not listening to this? Why is this not being rewritten? Why are they not pulling this back until it's done properly?
I would say the reason for that is political posturing and politicking. Unfortunately, this law went through the House and Parliament, and many of the MPs in the House didn't even turn up for the debate. There was actually no real debate about how to fine-tune or fix this what we say is a fatally flawed act in order to try and make it safer for vulnerable New Zealanders. There were 130 what we call supplementary order papers that were tabled by parliamentarians trying to make it safer, and they were all rejected. And a lot of the MPs who voted it through didn't even show up to the debates. The New Zealand Greens and New Zealand First decided to throw their weight behind it. And I don't really know what political deals took place, but in the end, parliamentarians, those who voted it through, because I think it was voted through 69 to 51, they said, well, basically, we'll do a Pontius Pilate and wash our hands of this, and we'll give it to the people. Let the people decide. And so, unfortunately, now New Zealanders have been burdened with the very, very serious responsibility of having to make a decision about a law that many people know nothing about and don't actually realise how unsafe it is.
And can I tell you, if I hadn't have just seen a floating by pamphlet, and I literally mean floating by, it was outside of the letterbox on the ground, and that was the whole entire euthanasia debate on a pamphlet. That was the only thing that I'd seen about it, apart from the book that I read by Carolise Trays, and I had a good read of that. But not everybody's going to read this book, are they? And not everybody's going to have access to more information. So do we really have enough information to put this to a vote?
I think a lot of New Zealanders are probably voting through their own personal experiences and perhaps out of a good deal of emotion, because this is a very emotional subject. I agree. And that's fine. Emotion shouldn't be put to one side, but we must ask ourselves, is this truly a safe law? And we say as lawyers unanimously, no, it is not safe. This is a really dangerous piece of legislation. And if it is voted into force, then we're going to have a very, very different country in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years than you could ever imagine we're going to have.
Give me a little, I mean, I already by the conversation I can gauge what that will be, but give me your snippet of what that might look like.
Okay, well, we can do that through the presentation that we've got here, because I'm looking here at assisted dying in Canada. If you just go back up. So in May 2018, let's look at the sort of the track record of euthanasia regimes abroad, just briefly, and talk about choice. And really, are Canadians now getting choice? And who in Canada is getting this so-called choice? I don't deny for a moment that there are genuinely deserving cases in Canada who are accessing euthanasia. That's fine. The biggest problem is that there are a lot of other people who don't actually have any choice, who are being pressured into this, whether it's by other people or by doctors or by failures in the healthcare system. Now, if you look at the presentation there, last year, as I said before, nearly 14% of Canadians who chose euthanasia said it was because they were lonely. That was one of their main reasons. Yeah. Where was their choice? Mm. 34% of them said that they were a burden. What choice did they have? If you look at the next slide, you'll see that in May 2018, the College of Practitioners in Quebec wrote to the health minister and said, we have a serious problem in Quebec, a serious shortage of palliative care for terminally ill people, and that is going to be forcing people to choose euthanasia because they don't have any other choice. They can't get proper health care. Yeah. So where was their choice? If you look at the next slide, in Oregon last year, over 50% of terminally ill people in Oregon who chose assisted suicide said that one of their main reasons was that they were a burden on their families. 59%. Now, how is that a choice? There's no compassion or choice in assisting the suicide of a person who doesn't want to be a bother. Mm. If you look also in Oregon, between 63 to 66% of all assisted suicides in the last 5 years are of people on low incomes accessing state health insurance. Mm. Now, one of them was Barbara Wagner, a 64-year-old woman with lung cancer. Her doctor said, look, we can keep you alive for years because we've got this medication. Her insurance company, which by the way was the state health insurance company, said, no, we won't fund that medication, but we will fund your suicide medication because it'll only cost $50.
Wow.
Now, where was her choice?
Wow. So
we have to ask, who are the people who are going to supposedly be given this choice in New Zealand? And this leads us to the next slide, which is safety. And this is our second and really big concern about this particular law, is that this law completely fails to protect vulnerable people from being pressured or manipulated into requesting euthanasia. And it's no surprise that vulnerable New Zealanders are going to be impacted by this law because that's been the experience overseas. If we look briefly overseas, at every euthanasia law that has been passed, there has been abuse of vulnerable people. In the Netherlands, just 2 years ago in the Netherlands, this is a country where they're euthanizing disabled newborn children, where they're euthanizing dementia patients, psychiatric patients and depressed people. A Dutch woman with dementia who refused to be euthanized was physically held down by her family members while the doctor then gave her a lethal injection.
That is sickening.
You can see that report for yourself. Across the border in Belgium, the Euthanasia Review Committee, this is the same kind of committee we're going to have here that's supposed to oversee the process. Now, Belgium, by the way, is a place where they are now increasingly euthanizing children. 3 children have been euthanized, 9, 11, and 17, where they're euthanizing patients who are depressed with bipolar illnesses, with psychiatric illnesses, schizophrenia, a transgender case involving a person with a botched sex change operation that led them to experience unbearable suffering. They were euthanized. In that particular country, the review committee was recently exposed as corrupt by one of its own members. And this member said, look, this is an industry here now, and the players in the industry are all on the review committee with me. And they are approving wrongful deaths. And innocent, vulnerable people are being euthanized. And the doctors who do that are getting away with it. If you look at the, sorry, go ahead.
In the Netherlands and in Belgium, would their bill have started similar to what ours will look like after this vote, if it's voted in?
No, it started. No, that's a good question. It started with a much vaguer and probably more flexible law than the one that we have currently got. But the problem is that, like all euthanasia laws, and this is a point I'll make soon, they inevitably expand. And they expand either through legislation, or they expand in what we call practical terms, where doctors themselves start to interpret the law in much broader and more flexible ways. And that's why in the Netherlands, which primarily started with euthanizing terminally ill people and very chronically ill people, in about 2009, they started euthanizing in greater and greater frequency people with dementia and psychiatric patients as well. So we see this, what we call as practical expansion of the law by doctors who interpret it their own way. If you look across to the next slide, over in Canada, now Canada's had a euthanasia law now for 4 years, and there have been a number of abuses. Roger Foley, Roger was, who came out publicly as a chronically ill man who basically was pressured by his doctors into requesting euthanasia. Candice Lewis, a 25-year-old woman with spina bifida, pressured by her doctors into requesting euthanasia. Sean Taggart, a man with ALS, pressured by the healthcare system who refused to give him the care he needed, into requesting euthanasia, and he ended up being euthanized. And then of course, this lack of palliative care in Quebec, forcing Quebecans who are terminally ill and can't get palliative care to request euthanasia. And the UN Special Rapporteur on Disabilities, she recently issued a very damning report saying that she was extremely worried about the impact of this law on disabled Canadians, and about she'd heard many worrisome claims about people being pressured. And what has the Canadian government done in response? It's expanding the law. It's now going to make it available to people who aren't just terminally ill, but people who are chronically ill and people who have disabilities.
So instead of this being what it obviously looks and sounds like a massive breach of human rights, what they're going to do is just create laws that cover it. So it's no longer a human right. Well,
there is no doubt that, I mean, I know that supporters of this law say there haven't been any abuses overseas, but I'm sorry, it's just false.
Yeah.
There have been in every jurisdiction where we have had euthanasia and assisted suicide, there have been abuses. There's no doubt about that, and I'm just giving you some examples. And this is important to note. These abuses have been reported despite the cloak of secrecy that covers the whole euthanasia process in each of those places. Every euthanasia law, and including the one that's currently being debated in New Zealand, for some reason, decides to cloak the whole process in secrecy. New Zealanders under this law are not going to know anything about what's actually happening in the process, because it's all been done in secret.
So we're not going to know, us New Zealanders are not going to know.
Well, the review committee in New Zealand will issue annual reports, but there's a lot of things that we will not be told in those annual reports. We won't be told the ethnicity of people who are being euthanized. We won't know the unbearable sufferings that people claimed to have, whether it was because of fear of physical pain or because of psychological sufferings like the ones that I've already mentioned. We won't know that. We won't know whether there are any cases of coercion or abuse.
Yeah. Which actually leaves us wide open to abuse and coercion, because if we're not going to have real statistics, we're not going to know. We're never going to know.
That's right. I mean, if this process is taking place in complete secrecy, then an abuser can navigate their way through that. And this is the real problem, and they will get away with it. And we're going to talk about criminal immunities very soon, but this law actually immunizes abusers, and we have a real concern about that as well.
Mm.
Let's move to the next slide, and perhaps against that background that I've just given you, we can have a look at the so-called protection against pressure or abuse in New Zealand, and that is hopelessly flawed. That basically this law puts the entire burden of detecting coercion or pressure in a patient onto the shoulders of one doctor who may not know them, who may not have ever met them before, and then it just says all they have to do is do their best. That's it. The net sum of this law's protection against abuse, against pressure, people being pressured, is one doctor doing their best.
Yeah.
And in doing their best, they have to do two things. They have to talk to members of the patient's family that the patient authorizes them to talk to. And they have to speak to other doctors involved in that patient's care. But that's a hopelessly flawed test, because the patient can just say, I don't authorize you to talk to my family. And the patient may not have any other doctors involved in their care. And so how are you going to detect coercion or pressure in any particular patient? Now, the Royal College of General Practitioners, these are our own GPs. They told the select committee, we can't detect pressure or coercion with that test. We can't do it in all cases, and there are going to be wrongful deaths. So those are our own doctors who have told the committee that they are not equipped to assess whether people are being pressured. And that's not surprising to me as a lawyer, because I can tell you that cases of the question of whether people are being pressured into things, we call this, terms like coercion and duress and so on. These are very, very complex issues that courts have to grapple with across many weeks of hearings and cross-examination, and even the courts can't give a complete foolproof safeguard in cases of people who might be acting under duress. And yet this law that we're now asked to vote on is giving that entire burden onto the shoulders of a doctor who is just not going to be capable of discharging that burden.
Doctors,
that's a real
about doctors, did they obviously they've all been briefed on this, and that they are going to be the one that it all lands upon their shoulders. Do they want to be involved in this kind of a law?
The majority of doctors, no, they don't. This is the statistic that supporters of the Act never tell New Zealanders. 52 to 58% of our GPs and 80% of our palliative care practitioners are totally opposed to euthanasia.
Wow.
And 98% of our palliative care doctors don't want to have anything to do with the process. They don't want to be involved.
Wow. So who's going to do the process if it goes through?
Well, there'll be a lot of doctors who are going to exercise a conscientious objection and say, I don't want to have any part in this process. And what will then happen is that the patient will be handed over to a very small group of doctors who have put their hands up saying, yes, I'm happy to help people in their lives. And they will become the doctor who has to examine the patient and assess their eligibility, and then also particularly assess whether the patient is being pressured into this process, bearing in mind that they'll never have met that patient before and they won't know anything about them. And again, they have this two-step test. Let me give you a practical example of how flawed this two-step test for pressure is. Let's say you've got an elderly woman in Northland. She is terminally ill and she's very frail, and she's being pressured by her manipulative daughter into requesting euthanasia. So she's gone along to her doctor, she's made the request. Now the doctor then says, look, I just have to assess whether you're being pressured. May I speak to any members of your family? No. Okay. Do you have any other doctors involved in your care? No, you're it. Oh, okay. Tick, tick. well,
Unreal.
I've done my best,
Unreal.
and clearly you're not being pressured. I mean, that's hopeless.
Yeah.
And that is the net sum of this act's protection against pressure. And that gives us great cause for concern in a situation not only where doctors are incapable of doing this, but where the whole process is going to be secret, and so no one's ever going to know. Not only that, but this particular law actually gives criminal protection to the people who are going to do the abusing. And I won't go into the specifics of that because it's a complex set of criminal provisions. But essentially, I'll tell you this. Under this law, an abuser, an elder abuser, or someone who's abusing their relative, will be able to pressure them into requesting euthanasia, and it will not be an offence.
Unreal. But then, I mean, like you were just saying it, why would it be an offence when it's being ticked off? It's coercion. Nobody's going to know. They're not going to request, or they'll request to speak to the family. That person might say, no, you can't speak to the family. Even if they did say, yes, speak to the family is going to lie because it's coercion. So how, it feels pretty...
It's hopeless. It's hopeless, and there will be wrongful deaths. That's exactly what our GPs have told the select committee in the parliamentary process. There are going to be wrongful deaths. And so the question really is for New Zealanders considering how to vote is, well, how many wrongful deaths is acceptable?
Yeah.
Bearing in mind that this law has been designed for a small group of people who are claimed to be suffering unbearably,
yeah.
Okay? How many vulnerable people are going to be sacrificed on the altar of choice to enable this small group of people to have their choice?
Yeah.
How many vulnerable people are going to be pressured into this process to facilitate that choice? That gives us great concern. Let's look at the next slide and the final slides, and which is the third reason. And some people call this the slippery slope. You know, the question is for your viewers is this: if this law passes, will this be the end of the conversation? And I can guarantee that it won't be. Because in a situation like this, the original threshold event is the decision to legalize euthanasia, no matter how restrictively we legalize it for. In this case, in New Zealand, we're going to legalize it just for terminal illness. But after that decision is made, then the debate becomes how to expand it and who else should get it. Now, New Zealanders, in New Zealand, we have an abhorrence of discrimination. Fair enough. Why should some people be given a particular choice and not others?
Yeah.
And this is what's going to play out if and when this particular law passes. The debates will then be, well, why should a terminally ill patient with unbearable suffering be allowed to get euthanasia? Why can't a non-terminally ill patient with unbearable suffering not get it as well? That's discrimination. Yeah. And then if that's acceptable, then, well, why shouldn't mentally ill patients who are in unbearable suffering, why shouldn't they get it too? And if we give it to adults, then why don't we give it to children? How can you discriminate against children? And if we given it to all those other people, then why don't we just do what they're now proposing to do in Holland, where 1 month ago, a Dutch MP tabled a new bill to make euthanasia lawful for anybody over the age of 75 who is just tired of living.
Wow.
So I can promise you that if you seriously think that this is the end of the discussion by voting this through, then you're sadly mistaken. This is only going to be the beginning, and logically, that is the only way. Is David Seymour, the person you all know who has brought this particular law? He says, look, no country that's ever had a euthanasia law has ever gone back. Well, there's only one reason for that. The only way forward with a euthanasia law is expansion.
Yeah.
There is no going back.
No going back. Yeah.
And so if you look finally at the next slide, that's what we've seen elsewhere in the world, is that if you go, so in Canada, we've seen the government now saying, well, we're going to expand the law in just 4 short years. we've seen it in the Netherlands for sure, because particularly with interpretative or practical expansion by doctors. You know, shortly after their law passed in 2002, they had this new protocol, the Groningen Protocol, which basically expanded euthanasia to seriously disabled newborn children. And since 2010, we've seen increasing numbers of euthanasia deaths for people with dementia and psychiatric illnesses. And then in Belgium, we had legislation in 2014 which expanded their law to from adults to children, no age limit. Okay, and then in Colombia, this is a South American country, in 2018 they expanded their euthanasia law to children over the age of 6. So this is not the end of the discussion. If this law passes, it'll just be the beginning. And I think we really need to start asking ourselves, how are we going to look as a society in 5, 10, 15 years time? Yeah. Is this the kind of regime that you want your children and your families to grow up in? Because this law will change everything for New Zealanders, and I think it will change New Zealanders. It will change the whole way that we look at people who are suffering, and not just terminally ill people, but our chronically ill, our disabled, our mentally ill, and so on.
It does actually feel that way, as though New Zealanders going in that direction, even in terms of, you know, the liberalisation of the abortion law and, you know, now this end of life choice. It seems to be that we're trying to take away pain and suffering and anything that's an oddity, and leaving us with just perfectly able-bodied people. And what do we end up with? No empathy for anybody, because we just kill everybody who doesn't suit us or isn't quite functioning properly in society. Do we just knock everybody off, one law to the other? I don't know. It feels like it's going in a pretty scary direction to me.
Yeah, I really do believe that if this law passes in its restricted form for terminal illness, it will undoubtedly expand. That has been the experience overseas, and it's a logical progression. And I can tell you as a lawyer that if this law passes now, we will have another Lucretia Seals in the next 5 to 10 years, only this time she won't be terminally ill, she'll be chronically ill, and she'll go to the High Court and challenge this law, and she'll probably win. Yeah. And that will put pressure back on Parliament to expand it. And then we'll see mentally ill people and chronically ill people or young people who all say, well, this is discriminatory against me as well. And in the meantime, with this kind of law, societal attitudes are going to change.
Exactly.
Because what the experience has been overseas in the countries that have legalized it has been this: that once the law passes, it creates a euthanasia becomes a legal right. Under this act, euthanasia will be a valid healthcare service. Okay, so it's something that is going to be looked upon not as some sort of extreme option right out here, but as something that is right there squarely, as options that are available to people. And so we will see gradual social acceptance of that right.
Yeah.
And social acceptance then over time starts to lead to social expectation. And this is the real concern that we have, is at the moment, if you get cancer, then the first question is, when does your chemotherapy start? Fast forward 15 years if this law passes and you get cancer at a time when we're in an economic crisis and our healthcare system is overburdened and there are too many elderly people and so on, that's not going to be the first question you're asked. The question then will be, what are you going to do? Are you going to do the right thing? Or are you going to make yourself a burden on the healthcare system? How could you be so selfish?
Yeah.
And that's what really concerns me, is that this law doesn't just change the situation for us, it changes us. It changes how we look at each other as a society. And I know that the focus of this legislation is on personal choice, but these personal choices are undoubtedly going to impact families, whānau, communities across this country in the future. There are going to be many, many painful and difficult discussions and uncomfortable discussions being had. there's reports that are already emerging now, studies that are emerging out of Canada that explore what they call the traumatization of healthcare workers who have been involved in this process, unwittingly found themselves involved in it. Nurses who had to administer a lethal dose. But not just that, the traumatization of families.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind that a person under this law could be euthanized without their family even knowing, because it's all about their personal choice. That can have devastating consequences for a family to find out that their loved one has been euthanized and didn't want them to know. And that happened to a man named Tom Mortier, a Belgian man who's now taken his case to the European Court of Human Rights because his old mother became depressed and she went into an institution and she never came out again. And what happened was that he got a letter from her which he received after she had been euthanized, saying, I have decided to be euthanized. And she was euthanized by a doctor who has single-handedly been responsible for a third of all euthanasia deaths in Belgium of psychiatric patients, a woman named Dr. Tienpont, who also, by the way, is on the Belgian Review Committee. She euthanized his mother, and you can imagine the pain and the suffering that he has gone through and the anguish at knowing that his mother, he could not be there for her in her darkest hour, and that the only person who was there for her was the doctor who was encouraging her to check out.
Unreal. With no love, no compassion, no care, just
yep,
Scotty, let's go.
And so I urge your viewers to really, really think this through carefully. Study the law. Go on and look at the law online. Go on to our website, Lawyers for Vulnerable New Zealanders, lvnz.org. You can see for yourself the real concerns we have with this legislation. We've come up with 35 fatal flaws in this piece of legislation. I've only outlined a few of them for you, but educate yourself on what the impact of this law is going to be, not only on New Zealand and not only on our healthcare profession and our doctors and so on, but also on our families, on our relationships, and on our communities. I really do believe that over time this is going to have really devastating consequences. But above all, my main concern is for vulnerable New Zealanders. That's my work. It's the work that I do is protecting vulnerable people from the state.
Yeah.
And a lot of the lawyers involved in our group do the same kind of work. And we are deeply, deeply concerned at how this law is going to impact the weakest and most vulnerable people in our country. And I urge your viewers to consider that too. So
let's just say that the majority tick no, and this vote and this bill does not go through, and so this legislation does not turn into a law. What time frame can they then change that if they decided to have another go at it?
Oh, it could happen immediately, and I suspect that it would. I think if this law didn't pass, then the End of Life Choice Society will probably try and redraft something else, and I'm sure David Seymour would be back with another one for discussion. And look, a lot of the lawyers in our group are not opposed to that. It's a question of, can this be done safely? And our research has shown, unfortunately, it can't be at the moment. There is not a legal regime in the world that has yet been able to achieve this without vulnerable people being pressured or abused in the process. So we're going to have to come up with something better than what we've got. But this law is not it.
It's not good. So, but you're saying if we, okay, just let's say it goes, it doesn't go through, and they're going to just keep on trying to pummel it back through again and try. What choice do we have but to just say, oh, we'll put it through then? If they're just not going to let it be, if they want to push this through, and this is this is the government pushing it through, where's the democracy at the moment as it is? I mean, we're having a massive, I can't even see, we don't even look like we have democracy in this country at the moment. So how's this vote going to change, or how's our voice going to change this vote?
Well, I think the more and more that New Zealanders speak out against this proposed law, and particularly if we vote it down at referendum, which could happen. I mean, as I said before, the polls are changing as more and more people realise how dangerous this law is, then I think that would send a very clear signal to our parliamentarians that, no, this is not something we want.
Yeah.
You know, the problem here is not the law. The law isn't broken. The healthcare system is broken.
Okay.
And so let's fix our healthcare system and give everybody in New Zealand true, equitable choice in their healthcare, and then have this debate. And then we can bring this law back to the table and work out, how can we make this safe? And until then, as I said before, people with no choice are going to cop it under this law in order to enable a very small group of people who have other choices available to them to exercise that choice. And I just don't think that's the kind of country we should be living in a country that fails to protect the weakest members of our country. I mean, we pride ourselves on being a civilized nation, and that means protecting those who are weaker and more defenseless. And this law fails in so many regards to do that.
So give us some ideas of what we could practically do. Just say, for example, we decide after this discussion that yes, this law needs more work, let's vote this down, let's say no for now because we know that this isn't quite right. What is the practical next step for just, democratic New Zealand? What do they do? Do they write to their MP? Do they write to the Prime Minister? What do they do?
Well, I think if there was a new law that was introduced, again, it would have to go through the same sort of process that this one has gone through. And there would be a select committee set up by Parliament to see, is there another way that we can panel beat this law into an acceptable and safe form? And at that point in time, we all would have a choice and a chance to voice our views about how a law could be developed that protects vulnerable people. I have yet to see one. I can see from experiences overseas that none of the regimes there have not had abuse. Absolutely, under this particular law that's on the table for our vote, that is going to lead to abuse, undoubtedly. And so it's a really hard task. It would be a really hard task to come up with a law that was safe for everybody, bearing in mind that this is the ultimate that we are debating here. It's whether or not, for the first time in our history, since we abolished capital punishment, whether we should start helping people in their lives if they ask for it. Are people really acting genuinely out of true consent? Are they being pressured? Do they have other choices, or don't they have any other choice? These are all the questions. How do you wrap a law around this process that makes it safe? And all that we say is that this law does not achieve that in any way. It's hopelessly flawed.
Unreal. An awesome discussion and massive food for thought, and I just hope that our ladies out there have a really good listen and they really reconsider even, because even I for one just thought it was literally, I want my nana to have her own choice, that's as simple as it was. Nobody's digging any deeper than that, it feels like. So this has just taken us a few levels deeper, lots to think about, and hopefully within the next 9 days, if people haven't already put their vote across, they might rethink some of this stuff. Thanks so much for coming along and chatting with us. I'll ask you to just provide us with some links to the website and things, and I'll attach them to these videos and things so people can do their own investigations. But thanks so much for giving us your time today, and it's been awesome chatting with you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thanks. See you.
Bye-bye.